Stephen and Sarah to turn off their cameras and their microphones. We're going to get back to you at 8 o'clock. And Dylan Berger, you are on controls this evening.
Good evening. I hope everybody's well. Sorry for the rain in the background. It is a
Uh,
typical Joburg evening.
It's a huge thunderstorm happening outside. And just a big welcome to everyone who's joining us around the world. I see we have people watching us from Philadelphia, from Sussex in the UK, from Vilnius, from Lisbon, from Ohio, from London, from San Diego, from Canada, from Baltimore. This has really attracted so many people. And Dylan, one of the things that you're going to be doing this evening is you're going to make sure that this is not just a one-way conversation, that we're involving the entire audience this evening. And that means that if people have questions or comments, they're going to actually be posting them on YouTube or Facebook or Zoom. And you're going to make sure that all of those, in fact, come through to us. Is that correct?
Spot on, spot on. So please don't hold back. Got a lot of comments on email during the week, so I'm looking forward to seeing them on live tonight.
So I actually want to address that because some people believe you should only listen to people you agree with, rather than listen to everyone. And that's certainly not our perspective, nor has it ever been our perspective. We speak to absolutely everyone. And the important thing is we need to learn to listen. And by listening, maybe we'll understand a little more and we may actually learn as well. So, Dylan, with that, let's talk about the Jewish report this week. And Joel Pollak, a big welcome to you. We're just welcoming everyone around the world. We have thousands and thousands of people who are watching us this evening, and we are broadcasting tonight on YouTube, on Zoom, and on Facebook. So, a big welcome. Where in the world are you? Joel, I think you're saying you can't hear us. While you try to sort that out, and maybe you need to log back and log back in. Uh, Dylan, let's look at the front page of the Jewish report this week. This week's Jewish report, it's actually a very serious Jewish report this week, because in essence, we believe that the voices of the Jewish community and we believe the voices of the pro-Israel community are really under enormous attack in South Africa. And we produce a newspaper, and we've done so for 25 years, that's distributed free of charge around the country through hundreds and hundreds of locations around the country. But the truth is, we can't produce a newspaper, and we can't do events like our Douglas Murray event, and we can't do webinars like tonight's webinar with Joel unless you are part of this process. Just to print the newspaper and distribute costs over 350,000 Rand a month. If you want to see us continue, if you want our Jewish community to have a voice, and after the 7th of October, there are so many people who wish to silence our community. If you believe in a Jewish voice, then we need you to contribute and donate to the Jewish Report, because without you, we lose that voice completely. Joel, just before we flip over, are you hearing us?
Yes, I have fixed the audio problem on my end, so it looks like we're good.
Fantastic. We'll be with you in a moment. We've just been talking about the importance of media and the importance of keeping voices like our voice alive in a country like South Africa, where we have both the political establishment and the fourth estate enormously hostile and trying so hard to silence any voice that is both pro-Jewish and pro-Israel. And that's why we're appealing to all the people watching this evening. We can't do this alone. We have to do it with you. Please donate to the Jewish Report. So the front page of this week's edition, which is out and available around the country, is in fact an appeal from myself to all of you to participate and to be part of this process. Don't forget as well, please, that you can see us, if not in hard copy, online, www.sajr.co.za. And we beg and plead with all of you. In order to save money, we're cutting our print run and our distribution points. You need to, in fact, sign up and be part of our newsletter to get information as well. All of our webinars are available on YouTube, and you can refer and come back and watch this webinar time and time again. We certainly hope you do that. So go onto our website, click on webinars, and you'll be able to do it. I want to stop for a moment and go over, if you would like to help keep the voice of the Jewish community alive, then we need you to donate. And the easiest way to do so is to go to bit.ly/SAJR-DON. You'll see all the details on the screen. And if you have a camera, take a picture of it. Please go on, make a donation. We need you to be bold and courageous, because after the 7th of October, to be the voice of the community took courage. It needs a courageous community to keep that voice alive. We're going to be posting these details and this information throughout the course of this evening. And as we mentioned, please, we're asking you, register to receive our email newsletter online. The easiest way to do that is a bit.ly link, SAJR inbox. If you do that, sign up. We can put you on WhatsApp groups. We can distribute our newsletter and our hard copy to you as well. So we ask you to do that. And with that, Dylan, thank you so much. You'll be posting all of that information into the chat section as well. Joel, I believe you know Michael Kransdorf.
Hey,
Yes, we've been together for a long time.
Fantastic. And Michael, thank you for the introduction to Joel. Really appreciate it. And Joel, enormously grateful to you for giving up your time in order to speak to a community that's very important to us. And I have a sense really important to you as well. Just before we begin, I believe you live in the Pacific Palisades, and your home was one of the few homes that actually survived the tremendous and horrendous fires that we saw over the last few weeks.
That's correct. 3 out of 4 homes were destroyed in the fire, and mine, by some miracle, was not. And the reason I asked to move the meeting earlier, and I'm very grateful that you were able to do that, was because I'm meeting with the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, who's a cabinet official, who's coming to the community to look at the ongoing efforts to remove hazardous waste in preparation for the removal of general debris so that residents can get back in and continue their lives and rebuild their homes. It's a complete disaster area at the moment, and I've been going up there almost every single day since the fires started on January 7th. But that's obviously very important. There are other things going on in the world, and we have to continue engaging in those as well.
So, Joel, I think a lot of people who are watching us this evening don't really know your South Africa connection. You were in fact born in Johannesburg. Walk us through a few minutes about your life.
Yeah, sure. So my parents are both native South Africans, both born and raised in Johannesburg. And my father is a semi-retired transplant surgeon. My mother's a physical therapist, both trained at Wits. And after my father's military service, he really wanted to go elsewhere to pursue his medical career, mostly because he was interested in doing transplantation, which, although it was in many ways pioneered in South Africa, had really taken off elsewhere. And of course, he had a lot of concerns about the apartheid system and where it was going. So he and my mother began a long process of trying to figure out where their lives were going to be. They didn't really want to raise kids in South Africa. They didn't see any sort of peaceful solution on the horizon. So they looked at the UK, they looked at Israel, they looked at Canada, they looked at Australia, and ultimately landed in Chicago, where my father, Raymond Pollak, pioneered the liver transplant program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And we grew up there. Even though I was born in South Africa, we moved to the United States 8 weeks after I was born. So I really spent my whole childhood in Oak Park, River Forest, and Skokie, Illinois, especially Skokie, where my parents still live in the house they moved into in 1984. And it was a very interesting time to be South African because we were really raised with no connection to South Africa except the occasional family visit and perhaps some explanations demanded by children of parents as to what was going on the nightly news when South Africa was in the news a lot during the state of emergency and the height of the anti-apartheid struggle. And then it suddenly became very interesting to be from South Africa around 1990 when Nelson Mandela was let out of prison and the negotiations started. There was intense interest in the United States in South Africa's transition to democracy. So I really started following events in South Africa pretty closely. And at the same time, there was also general interest, not just among ex-South Africans, but general interest and to the point where we were reading South African novels in school. When I was 15 years old, my high school English class read Cry the Beloved Country, and they invited my dad to give a lecture on South African history, which he knows very well. And people were just fascinated. I mean, if you can imagine a room of 15-year-olds just on the edge of their seats learning about South African history. So I was very interested. I studied African history in university when I went to Harvard, not as a major subject, but it was part of my curriculum. And Nelson Mandela actually came to speak at a special ceremony at Harvard in the fall of my final year there. He's one of the only people to this date that has ever been honored with an honorary doctorate outside of the normal commencement or graduation cycle, the others being George Washington, Winston Churchill, and there may be one other one, but essentially, I think at that time he was the third. So I had an intense interest in learning more about South Africa. We took the first family trip in a very long time in 1998 back to South Africa. It had been more than a decade since we had been. Everything was unfamiliar, but changing and interesting and exciting. And I applied for a fellowship to study with the Rotary Foundation Ambassadorial Scholarships. And I went back to South Africa in 2000 and eventually stayed on to try to become a freelance journalist, which I was in a sense. I wrote pieces for the San Francisco Chronicle, and I ended up writing some local pieces. I wrote a profile of Patricia DeLille in The Big Issue, which is sold by homeless people at the street corners in South Africa. And I also wrote for American papers, other papers. And I started covering events. And one of the most formative events for me was the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001. And at that time, I was writing for a left-wing magazine called Color Lines, which I think still exists online in some form. But that was a very far left publication. One of its close associates was a guy named Van Jones, who would then go on to be an Obama administration official, and now he's a regular commentator on CNN. He's actually one of the more candid ones when he talks about the left. He talks about the weaknesses of the left as well as his own left-wing ideas. But I was watching this carnival of hatred, which the Jewish institutions had largely boycotted, and the only people there were these South African students, essentially, who were confronting thousands of people on a daily basis, these anti-Semitic mobs. And I had this conversation with my editor, who was sitting next to me at the time watching all this, and I pointed to a banner someone was holding with a Star of David that was dripping blood, and I said, "You don't see that as a problem?" And he said, "No, well, it's Israel's fault if they put that symbol on their flag. It's actually just a national symbol. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism." So I began to realize around that time, and not just for that reason, but I began to realize around that time that my politics weren't really fitting me very well anymore. And I began to look at other things, and eventually I got offered a job by Tony Leon to be his speechwriter. And I took it immediately. It was a thrilling opportunity to witness South African politics up close in this transition that had fascinated me for so long. And I ended up working for the DA and for Tony for 4 years. I was part of Helen Zilla's mayoral campaign when she won in Cape Town, which was also very exciting. It was the first time the ANC had really lost power in a democratic election. It was very tough for them to handle, but they eventually did handle it, and the DA did very well in Cape Town and the Western Cape. And then I met my wife, who I've been married to for 15 years. She was an intern in Tony's office. Julia is the daughter of Rhoda Kadali, who died in 2022.
So let's
But
talk about Rhoda for a second. Rhoda is anti-apartheid royalty.
right,
In fact, you wrote a book, Rhoda, about your
right.
mother-in-law.
I actually knew Rhoda before I knew Julia because Rhoda had a column in the Business Day, and I would read her column, and I was always impressed by the things she had to say. And so I went to Tony's secretary, who was a woman named Sandy Slack, and I said, "Sandy, do you have Rhoda's number?" And she said, "Yeah." So she gave me Rhoda's number, and I would call her every once in a while, and we would have these conversations. We probably had phone conversations once every couple of weeks for about 2 years before I even met Rhoda. And the reason we met was she said, "Hey, I've got this daughter who's coming to work with you, and she's going to Harvard next year." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And I went there, and I'd be happy to talk to her about it. And then she came, and we were friendly, but nothing really more than that. And then Rhoda wanted to invite me to Julia's surprise birthday party. So she came to Parliament. And that was actually the first time I met her.
That was
So
a big surprise.
yeah. Yeah. So, I went to Julia's birthday party, and each of us, we were each dating other people at the time, and that was it. And then eventually we broke up with our significant others for reasons completely unrelated. And I resisted this relationship for a long time for a variety of reasons, but eventually we decided to give it a try. And Julia went to Harvard, and then I decided, okay, well, I've got to go back to the States as well. So I went to Harvard Law School at that point, and we courted throughout the time she was finishing her undergraduate degree. And then when we both graduated in 2009, we got married shortly thereafter, and it was a great ceremony. We had a wedding in Cape Town with the Chabad rabbi and the Beit Din and whole Orthodox mishpacha, even though probably 75% of the people there weren't Jewish because they mostly came from Rhoda's friends and family. And it was a great experience. And I went back to the States, and I was plunged into Republican Party politics, which I got very involved with.
So,
Yeah,
Joel, would you
yeah.
say, was it the racism conference in 2001 which was the factor that turned? Because I think we could describe you as a typical Jewish liberal Democrat that
Yeah,
maybe
yeah, that was
moved.
a big part of it. It wasn't the only thing. I mean, it's a longer story. I think the transition had already begun before that. My undergraduate degree was in environmental science, and I really stressed the scientific part of that. But the full name of the concentration at Harvard is called Environmental Science and Public Policy, and it was an effort to bring together the sciences with the politics or policy part of it. And I noticed fairly early on that there was a mismatch between the science and the policy. So I began to question some of the left-wing environmental dogmas from a pretty early stage, but it didn't change my overall political identity. I think when I got to South Africa, it was the start of the AIDS crisis with Thabo Mbeki insisting that HIV didn't cause AIDS. And that may have been more important in a sense because there was no more glaring example, really, of a left-wing ideological view, because in Thabo Mbeki's view, it was really a problem of economic disparity that was causing all this immune deficiency, not a virus. So it was kind of this extreme version of left-wing socialism that was literally causing people to die. And because I came from a scientific background, the way I approached my political views was to say, well, I want to improve the lot of the people who are worst off. So let's try this method. Let's try socialism. Let's try left-wing policies, redistribution, all kinds of things like that. And when I saw that those weren't working, I said, okay, well, the goal remains the same. Let's try the other methods. And I think through my exposure to some of the ideas that Tony was expressing as an alternative to the ANC's policies, and then later through my return to the United States and my exposure to the various turbulent movements in the Democratic Party, I began to realize that my place was more on the right than on the left. But that was a very long process. But certainly the Durban Racism Conference was part of it because what I realized then, and a month later, you have to remember many things happened in succession at that time. There was the Durban Racism Conference in August 2001. Then there was a nationwide campaign with one of the anti-Israel activists from that conference, a guy named Uri Davis, who was a leading proponent of the idea that Israel is an apartheid state. And he was hosted by Kasatu, and they brought him around the country. That caused huge tumult in Jewish communities as people tried to confront this kind of challenge for the first time in the democratic era. And then about a week later, September 11th happened, which sent everybody into shock for a few weeks. But finally, in October 2001, Ronnie Kasrils and Max Ozinski, who was kind of working with him, came out with this declaration in which they blamed Israel for the conflict and said that South Africans of Jewish descent had to sign this declaration and dissent publicly from any association with the state of Israel. And, you know, as a person who identified as left wing, I thought, I opposed some of the policies of the Israeli government, at least that's how I felt at the time. And I said, well, but this is not the right way to do it. So I tried to become involved and help them improve things. And all I did was make their text better rather than more correct. So I thought, this is crazy. And they also attacked the Jewish community. So I got very involved in that debate. And
You, in
eventually,
fact, famously debated Ronnie Kasrils at a Harbonim camp and wrote a book called The Kasrils Affair.
yeah, I didn't realize that Habonim debate was so famous. But yes, I did debate him there. And I wrote a book called The Casuals Affair, which I wrote with my thesis advisor, Milton Shane at the University of Cape Town. And Milton was great because, and is great, but he was, I think, very important to that project because he helped me understand the context in which this debate was happening. It wasn't just a foreign policy debate. It was really a debate about the place of Jews and other minorities in the new South Africa. And there was a movement at the time by the then hegemonic ANC to say that, well, we're not getting the votes of these minority communities, but let's at least obtain these kind of symbolic pledges of allegiance. And so it was almost as if the price of belonging to South Africa became that you had to give up on your association with Israel if you were Jewish, which you cannot really do. I mean, there is a strain of anti-Zionist thought in the Jewish community, especially before 1948, 1945 especially. It was largely debunked and discredited by the Holocaust. I mean, it did not survive the test of time. The anti-Zionist movement believed a variety of things, but one of the things they believed was that the model of assimilation would work. And Theodor Herzl realized that didn't work very early on. Another thing they believed was that the liberation of Jews as such would have to await the liberation of the world's working classes, since Jews were kind of like a proletarian class. And so the Soviet Union essentially would have to lead the global revolution that would liberate Jews. And there are probably communists who still believe that sort of thing. But after Stalin's death, certainly in the 1950s, and you were allowed to talk openly in left-wing circles about the abuses of the Stalinist regime, that also was discredited. I mean, Stalin put a bunch of Jews in eastern Siberia, but it didn't really lead anywhere. Meanwhile, he persecuted Jews and so forth. So anti-Zionism is kind of a recreational belief, but it's not really anything grounded in reality. And basically to tell Jews that they have to dissociate themselves from Israel, which features in the daily prayers of Jews several times a day, it is an anti-Semitic proposition. So the price of being a citizen in South Africa was you had to essentially divest yourself of your Jewish identity, which I don't think anybody should have to do, Jews or otherwise. So that was a really interesting thesis, and it was my first published book. So there have been several others.
So other ones include See No Evil. But I want to get onto US politics because I think that's why most people have tuned in this evening. And
Sure.
And I want to first I want to ask the question: how do you describe yourself? Right wing, conservative? What if we were to attach a label to you that you were comfortable with? What would that label be?
I'm conservative. I mean, I would say my political views are conservative, and that's a broad definition, but that's how I describe myself. And you can say, well, there are very various different variations on conservatism. My friend Mark Levin, who's a radio host here in the United States, calls himself a constitutional conservative. You know, my views on social issues tend to be quite libertarian. Even though I have traditional views myself, I tend to be less inclined to think that the government should be involved in social and moral issues, which is not to say the government can't set a social and moral example. It's just that I don't think that certain things should be legislated or regulated, but conservative is a pretty good label.
So you wrote a book called The Agenda,
Right.
the things Trump should do in his first 100 days.
Right. I have
Where
it here
does
next.
it, where does that come from? Did it have Trump support? How was it received by the Trump administration? And is he adhering to your playbook?
Yeah, well, it came from a moment in late May, early June last year. Donald Trump had been convicted in a court in Manhattan of 34 counts of falsifying business records. Now, if you had actually followed the details of the case, it was a completely absurd case. It made a mockery of the American judicial system. The person prosecuting Trump had run for office. You know, we elect many of our prosecutors, not the federal ones, but we elect the state and local ones. This fellow, Alvin Bragg, had run for office promising to prosecute Trump, okay, which is already a problem. It's not illegal to say that, but it certainly discredits any subsequent prosecution. It's sort of like saying in the Stalinist mode, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. I mean, he didn't say what he was going to prosecute Trump for. He just said he was going to prosecute Trump. Okay, so he gets elected and he works for a while. He looks at the evidence and he decides there isn't really a case. One of his leading prosecutors in his office, what they call the line prosecutors, the sort of civil servants who aren't elected, but who are the ones who do the actual work, then resigned and wrote a book saying that there was evidence that Trump should be prosecuted. And what was the evidence? The evidence was that Trump paid $120,000 to an adult film actress named Stephanie Clifford, otherwise known as Stormy Daniels, as part of a non-disclosure agreement. It didn't mean he actually had an affair with her, although he might have. I don't think it really matters. But there are these kinds of non-disclosure agreements all the time. In fact, Congress itself has a fund that it uses to pay for non-disclosure agreements when staff members of Congress accuse members of Congress of sexual misconduct. Trump paid this person $120,000 right before the election in November 2016. Had they been campaign expenses, he would have been required to disclose them, but they would not have come out until after the election. So he wouldn't, because they were paid so closely to the election, there was actually nothing wrong with him not disclosing them until after the election. But they weren't, in fact, campaign expenses. They were personal expenses, at least on the understanding that the Federal Elections Commission, which governs campaign expenses, had traditionally taken. So these payments were known. They were personal payments made through Trump's then lawyer, Michael Cohen. And the Federal Elections Commission took no action against Trump. The federal prosecutors, even after raiding Michael Cohen's home and office, found no evidence to prosecute Trump. But suddenly, and I apologize for this light going out, we have these energy saving lights in our office. Suddenly, the local prosecutor decided that he had to prosecute Trump. He had no authority to do it because federal elections are a federal matter for federal prosecutors, federal courts. They don't belong in state or local courts. But this guy decided there was some way he could kind of twist the statute, twist the language of the law a little bit, and he accused Trump of a state crime, falsifying business records, in relation to a federal crime for which Trump had never actually been charged or convicted. And the federal crime was failing to report these payments as campaign donations. You can tell already by the explanation, it was just a mess. Trump was convicted in front of a jury of people from Manhattan. Manhattan is a jurisdiction that votes over 80% for Democrats, usually. So if you take a Republican politician and put them in front of a Manhattan jury, most of the people on the jury will vote against the Republican politician. I like our jury system, but it wasn't the best example of its use. And so most people believed that this was the weakest of all the cases against Trump. Even if he was going to be convicted, it was likely to be overturned. But you're watching this happen, and I'm sitting there, and Trump is going through the formalities of being convicted and being told to show up for sentencing. And the length of sentence for each of these 34 counts was significant enough that he could spend the rest of his life in jail for making these payments, which themselves are not illegal. The payments are not illegal. Paying so-called hush money is perfectly legal according to the legally executed agreement. There's nothing illegal about it. He was just accused of misreporting it, basically a bookkeeping error, which wasn't a bookkeeping error, but that's what he was going to go to jail for the rest of his life for. And to me, this looked like real third world stuff. This was something that should not happen in the United States of America. We had seen it a little bit in South Africa when I was there with some of the shenanigans, not just around Jacob Zuma, but around the prosecutor who was prosecuting Jacob Zuma was accused of being an apartheid spy and back and forth. And during the time I was working in Tony Leon's office, there was one part of the intelligence service that was bugging another part of the intelligence service. And so our offices were bugged. I mean, I had seen this movie before, and it was not really becoming of the world's leading democracy. And I was pretty upset about it. And after stewing about it for a few days, I decided I'm not really good at being angry for very long. So I thought, let me write something positive and let me look ahead to January 2025. And what would it be like if Trump overcame all of these challenges and actually won the presidency? And I felt that what Trump needed to do in the midst of all this media hype around this conviction was to project a vision for what his presidency would actually look like. And so I wrote the agenda and came up with about 200 things that I thought he should do and that he could do on day one. And the amazing thing is he's done most of them. I mean, I said he should do them in the first 100 days, which is our traditional metric for measuring presidential success in new administrations. He did most of them in the first week. And so I'm very impressed with the effectiveness and speed of the Trump administration so far. Some of the things he's done, weren't in my book, but most of them were. I did not predict that he would want to take over Gaza, so that was not in the book. But some other things were.
So Joel, I presume that it's common cause that South Africa has pissed off America, for want of a better description.
Yes.
And I think we've seen it in a number of different ways. We saw the land expropriation tweet from Trump this week. We saw Marco Rubio last night announcing that he's not coming to the G20 meeting in South Africa. We've seen Ted Cruz attacking South Africa over South Africa trying to force the Taiwan trade mission to leave Pretoria. We've seen tweets about BRICS. Have we actually genuinely angered the Trump administration? Are we in their crosshairs?
Yes, yes. For a variety of reasons. So I would say, generally speaking, there are three reasons that this is the case. Number one is geopolitical. We don't have a Cold War anymore with the United States facing off against the Soviet Union. Although I would add that the ANC seems to think that we do. The ANC may be the only political party in the world who thinks the communists won the Cold War, possibly because the end of the Cold War brought them into power. But the reality is the communists lost, and they lost for a reason. But we're not in that bipolar world anymore. But we are in a world where the liberal world order, for lack of a better term, the one in which free trade and the flow of ideas can thrive, is under threat. It's fashionable in the media, both in the United States and in South Africa and in Europe, to say that the threat is really nationalism. The threat is the right-wing movements. But in reality, the resurgence of nationalism and Trump's foreign policy of America first and that sort of thing is a reaction to the steady decline of the world and especially of national fortunes under what, for lack of a better term, is often called globalism or globalization. Now, I'm actually very pro free trade, and during the anti-globalization movement of the early 2000s, I thought that the attacks on the free trade movement were really silly and counterproductive. Countries need to participate in the world economy. It makes everybody better off. But what's happened is that since the admission of China into the global system of trade, China has exploited the free rules of the global economy, not just to enrich itself, but to impoverish its trading partners, to destroy domestic manufacturing, to flood the market with cheap goods that then make countries reliant on Chinese imports, to extend credit to African countries, for example, on favorable terms for China that the African countries can't pay back anymore, and then China seizes the ports or the assets or forces the developing world into joining China's One Belt, One Road initiative. So China has been admitted to the world trade system in the hope that, if anything, it would liberalize China domestically in political terms. But instead, what has happened is China has basically used the free trade system to pose a geopolitical threat to its trading partners and especially to the United States. So if you look at what Trump's doing, it's not just South Africa. He's looking at countries in which the United States has invested significant amounts of money and political capital, and sometimes human capital, and looking at whether they're dealing with China or not. Look at what happened in Panama. The United States built the Panama Canal at the cost of tens of thousands of American workers who died in the malarial swamps of Central America to build this canal, and then gave the canal back to Panama. And yet the canal was essentially being run for the benefit of China for the last few years. And Trump had a real problem with that. And so he sent Marco Rubio to Panama to renegotiate our relationship with Panama, basically saying, unless you stop allowing China to take advantage of this canal at our expense, we are going to take it back from you. Actually, we have this provision in the treaty that allows us to do it. We'll come and just take it back, and you can't stop us. You can't stop us militarily, and you can't stop us legally. So Panama very quickly said, okay, we're leaving this China thing. We're leaving the One Belt, One Road initiative, and we're going to operate in the Western Hemisphere and work with the Western world. So South Africa is not unique in that sense because the United States perceives China as a threat, and South Africa has really played footsie, if you, want to use a colloquial term, with China, moving the Taiwanese embassy out of Pretoria, doing joint military exercises with China, all kinds of things.
And with Russia, of course.
What's that?
And joint military exercises with Russia.
Yeah.
And supplying arms to Russia through the Lady R incident and threatening the American ambassador, the last previous ambassador, Ruben Brigitte.
I'll get to Russia in a second. I'll get to Russia in a second. But basically, China is one level of it. The Russia issue, as you mentioned, I don't want to waste too much time on it because we do have limited time. But South Africa has been overly indulgent, shall we say, toward Russia. And Trump is not focused on Russia to the same degree that he's focused on China. But Democrats are very focused on Russia. Democrats decided belatedly, because they were very pro-Russia until about 2014, but Democrats decided that Russia was bad for whatever reason. We don't have to go into it, but they are also upset with South Africa's foreign policy because of what you mentioned, because South Africa was frustrating the Biden administration in the Biden administration's effort to isolate Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. Okay, that's one part of it. Then there's South Africa's association with a variety of rogue states and terrorists, frankly. When you show up at the International Court of Justice to try to disarm Israel from defending itself against a genocidal terrorist organization, you are effectively siding with radical Islamic terrorists. There's no civilized country that should want to do business with you after that. It's an immoral stance, and we can go into it in detail if you want, but it was also a very, very sharp signal that South Africa is not playing along with the West and that it is strengthening a process through which the tyrants of the Middle East and other places abuse international institutions to attack not just Israel, but the United States. For example, Trump put sanctions on the International Criminal Court, which is now trying to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. But Trump put sanctions on them because they started going after American soldiers. They were being used to go after American military personnel for things that happened in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever it was. But the United States said, that's not on. We are not allowing any of you to come here and investigate us for essentially doing what we could to respond to terrorism. Biden came in and reversed that, which was unfortunate. But South Africa basically has doubled down on it and said, okay, we've formed this little Hague group and we're going to focus on all these international institutions and we're going to strengthen them and use them against Israel, especially Israel. They're obsessed with Israel. Meanwhile, of course, South Africa didn't enforce the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court when Vladimir Putin wanted to come to South Africa. I mean, South Africa has decided it can pick and choose when it likes these international institutions. So people have noticed that as well. They don't use them against Russia. They don't use them against China. They don't use them against Sudan or other countries that are rights deficient. They only use them against the West. So that's not okay. And that's also not okay for Republicans or Democrats. And then finally, there's the question of South Africa's own internal policies. South Africa is a very important country on the African continent, and it has a potential to play a larger role, not just in African affairs, but global affairs. But to do that, it actually needs to be strong. And it's true of every country. America has a strong military. We have a very strong military, but we also know that our real strength is our economy. And it's the same with South Africa. South Africa has an interesting history, interesting democratic transition 30 years ago. Okay. But South Africa's global influence is diminishing, not just because it takes some fairly crazy foreign policy stances, but also because economically it's fading. It's just fading and fading and fading unnecessarily because it has so much to offer theoretically in terms of natural resources, in terms of industrialization in the African continent, in terms of the skills and the drive of the people. You take an individual South African out of South Africa and they're the richest person in the world. They become Elon Musk. I mean, it's an incredibly hardworking country in some ways, and yet you have this system in South Africa that discourages talent, that discourages innovation, that discourages investment. And Americans have a problem with it because, hang on a second, you want us to help you, we want to help you, and we want you to be our ally, and we want you to be strong. But you cannot be strong, and you can't even be useful to us if you are not performing at your full potential, and if in fact you are degrading that potential. If the lights shut off when we come to visit, or if the trains shut down and commuters can't get to work and money disappears into overseas bank accounts. And I mean, hang on a second, this is not actually a strong partner after all. This is actually a weak and failing partner. But right now, it remains a very important partner, potentially. We have an interest in a strong South Africa. And unfortunately, South Africa is committed to domestic policies that weaken South Africa and make it less capable and therefore make it a problem rather than part of the solution to international issues when they arise. And so I think enough is enough as far as the Trump administration is concerned. There was kind of an effort to talk about these things and smooth them over during the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration. And this time it's really just, it's gone beyond what I think the United States is willing to tolerate. And I think the Trump administration expects to see very clear changes in South Africa's foreign and domestic policy.
So, Joel, there was one thing that the African National Congress did and they were stupid enough to actually release the video. But Nomvula Mokonyane, the Deputy Secretary General of the African National Congress, recorded a video and published a video where she said, we want to change the name of Santon Drive. So the American embassy, as she actually meant the American consulate, so the American consulate will have to change their letterhead to be One Leila Khalid Drive. That
Yeah.
she publicly states, a slap in the face to America, because it was Leila Khalid who tried to kill American passengers, hijacked American passengers, blew up an American airplane, and she publicly states this, and yet the Biden administration did nothing. Or did they do something and we just don't know about it?
Well, I don't know what they did about it, but I can tell you that if that change goes through, the U.S. consulate in Johannesburg will be closed and will not be reopened. It's not going to be moved. It's not going to another office. If they rename that street after Leila Khaled, then the United States consulate will close, and the United States will not do business with Johannesburg, which is a shame for both sides in a way, but you cannot do business with a country that honors a murderer, a hijacker, a terrorist. It's fundamentally at odds with the interests of the United States, and it's odds really with the values of civilization. So, that's not me saying it as a private citizen. I mean, I've had discussions about South African policy with people in the White House, frankly, and they are on board with the idea of closing the consulate if that street is renamed. Now, you might say, well, that's going to hurt the people who might be the most pro-American, people who are looking for visas, people who want to bring American investment into South Africa, or okay. But that's a decision the South African government has to make. If you name streets after terrorists, we will not be doing business with you. And I think that's how the administration feels. Also, I'm sure that one of the reasons, again, that there's bipartisan frustration with South Africa is that it did start happening under the Biden administration. So actually, probably they did notice it. I mean, I don't think they said much about it, but the South African consulate in Johannesburg will be closed if that name change is made. Now, they might decide to change the street name elsewhere. I mean, okay, whatever. I think it's internally corrosive to South Africa to honor terrorists and people who want to murder other people. Now that we're talking about it, the only reason people weren't killed in that incident was because I think there were air marshals aboard the flight who happened to tackle Khalid and her fellow hijackers and restrain them until the plane landed. But, had it not been for those people, she would have killed a lot of people. And you cannot control crime in a country that thinks there's some use for murder. I mean, if your position is that it's okay to kill innocent people and to hijack airplanes for the right cause, then you haven't really ruled out murder. I'm not talking about violence in the course of a military conflict where there's some understanding that civilians could be in harm's way as a result of legitimate military actions. No, if you murder innocent people and you say that in some context that's okay, you're going to probably have a crime problem. I mean, it's corrosive of the rule of law and morality in society in general. So I don't know why South Africans would want to do it. I understand the ANC has an ideological commitment to this idea that, all these Palestinians are freedom fighters. That's okay. I mean, you can take that position, but we will not be operating there. And I don't think Americans will feel comfortable traveling to South Africa if they have to get their visas renewed or get, extra pages in their passport on Leila Khalid Drive. It's just, it's not going to happen.
Joel, can I ask,
So,
isn't there a
sorry,
risk?
Mike, please go ahead.
Thanks, Howard. Isn't there a risk that America loses South Africa because of these hardball tactics, that South Africa just goes straight into the arms of China and Iran, and now they're sort of on the fence. We play both sides, but in response to this kind of threats, that South Africa actually leaves the Western camp altogether and comes out, as it were, as a full-blown member of the China-Iran camp.
Of course, there's that risk. And I think it's one that the Trump administration has decided to take. In other words, if you want to join China, join China. We will be against you in that sense. So you'll have us as an enemy, but also good luck with that. I mean, what has the experience been of African countries working with China? Has it been positive? They've built some infrastructure in some places, but the price of Chinese investment is Chinese control. And it's more brutal than British colonialism, let's say. The Chinese have no regard whatsoever for human rights, and they don't care if they impoverish your country because they're in this for themselves, not for you. Whereas at least the British had this idea that they could go around, helping civilizations with parliaments and literacy and whatever. But China is not going to invest in South Africa in the ways that even the now hated colonial powers did. I mean, China is basically going to strip Africa of its mineral wealth and own whatever it can, and that's the end of it. And some individuals might do very well in South Africa doing business with China in the same way that individuals can always find a way to do well. But I think the Trump administration is basically saying to the South African government, if you want to be part of China's sphere of influence, you want to make that choice, good luck with that. You can do that, but then you're shut out of our sphere of influence with all the benefits that it has. And, I'm not saying this is an American strategy, but if you look at what Elon Musk has been saying on his social media platform, even with Trump enforcing immigration very strictly at the moment, Elon Musk is saying, you know what, South Africans are great. Uh, we should make it easier for South Africans to leave South Africa. We should bring them in here. Uh, and I think that would be the approach that the United States might take. It might say, okay, well, our approach will then be to extract the most highly skilled South Africans and leave the rest of the country to rot. I mean, if you want to do that, we're not going to abandon all South Africans, but if South Africa chooses to side with China, good luck to you. That's basically the approach they're taking.
So, Joel, I know we have limited time,
Yeah.
and there are a lot of people with questions, but I want to talk about the impact of some of the things that we've seen. So the one thing which wasn't specifically targeted at South Africa, but the stopping of US aid or USAID, one of the impacts that had in South Africa, about 7.5 to 10 billion rand a year, is in fact spent on antiretrovirals in South Africa. And that program has now collapsed under the 90-day suspension as things have been reviewed. Is there any way that South Africa could try and negotiate that back? Because obviously that's a life and death situation for many very vulnerable South Africans.
I think so, but let me just say a couple of things. First of all, it's important to remember how that program came about, the PEPFAR program. The PEPFAR started 20 years ago, not because South Africa didn't have the money and needed the money from the United States. It started because the Bush administration wanted to save lives in South Africa, and Thabo Mbeki was not allowing doctors to prescribe antiretrovirals. And so the Bush administration found a way to introduce antiretroviral drugs into South Africa to save people, first by working with the South African military, and then by endowing this program. So it wasn't as if South Africa didn't have the funds to do it. It just didn't have the political will. And so PEPFAR really was a program that emerged because of the opposition of the South African government to doing anything at all about HIV. That's its origin. So when Americans look at how money is spent in South Africa, they look at the fact that South Africa has a military conflict of sorts going on in the DRC. Now, that may also be because at some level that may serve American interests in some way. Maybe, I've talked to some people in American foreign policy circles who are supportive of that, who are not, whatever. There are different opinions about it. But I'm just talking from the point of view of an American taxpayer looking at it, saying, wait a minute, you have money to send a military operation into the heart of Africa that isn't going very well, where you don't really have a core national interest, but we have to subsidize the health of South Africans. I mean, how does that work? Why do we have to pay for that? Why can't you pay for that? Just bring your military home, focus on protecting your border, what you need to do. But why are you having all these military adventures and peacekeeping missions everywhere? That's just not useful. And you've clearly got the money, so you should pay for it. That's I think the spirit in which a lot of this is being done, which is to say, are we getting value for the aid that we provide? And I think it would be a different conversation if South Africa had been eager to help the United States in any way on any other front. If South Africa, for example, had taken its experience in reconciliation and said, we want to mediate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine so it doesn't become this ghastly affair that kills hundreds of thousands of people and costs tens of billions of dollars. Or how about we're going to tell the Palestinians, who we have good relations with, to lay down their arms and end the arms struggle the way the ANC did so there can be successful negotiations. I mean, if South Africa were using its very formidable diplomatic tools in a way that was in furtherance of a common goal, then I think the United States would say, okay, that's why Americans don't have a problem with foreign aid to Israel. I mean, Israel's the largest recipient of foreign aid, and while there's some criticism of it, there's a general sense that Israelis are very grateful for it, that they do what we ask when we ask them to do things. Sometimes it's not what Israel wants to do, but generally the Israelis will go along with what the United States wants. And there's a sense that there's value for money because when we plow money into research and development in Israel, things like the Iron Dome get invented, which can then be used by the United States. Donald Trump's now talking about putting Iron Dome all over the United States or expanding it, and getting kind of broader use out of it. So I think South Africa needs to be useful to the United States. So I think there could be funding restored for that program, which you point out has some really important aspects to it, and it's important that people's lives are saved. At the same time, there really has to be a conversation about what is South Africa actually paying for? How does South Africa manage its own public funds? And is South Africa going to be helpful to the United States on the world stage? So I think that conversation has to happen.
Joel, if we can ask about AGOA. So for many people who watching the program, they may not know about AGOA itself, but it's really a program that was aimed at particularly poor countries, not countries like South Africa who are developing, almost developed, but it was aimed to allow countries that were poor to export to the USA without any tariffs. And it's up for renewal in the very near future. If you were a betting man, is South Africa going to be able to retain its position on AGOA?
If I were betting on it, I'd say no, not without significant changes. That was already in the cards before Trump was elected, by the way. If you look at what the Democratic senators were saying about South Africa's participation in AGOA, they were very skeptical about it because of South Africa's closeness to Russia. That's one part of it. And the other part is that to some extent, not just in South Africa, but to some extent, there's an awareness that Chinese firms have exploited AGOA simply to relocate in South Africa and export to the American market under favorable terms. So, the purpose of AGOA is not to enrich China, it's to enrich Africa. There is an understanding also that, we don't really want to be too choosy about where Africa gets its foreign investment. I mean, if China is opening factories and employing Africans and developing Africa's industrial base, that's good for Africa. And, we can set aside some of our differences over policy with China to at least recognize as a common interest in a prosperous Africa. But South Africa's path at the moment is not one of prosperity and expansion and growing the industrial base and building greater power generating capacity and encouraging innovation. There are pockets of excellence in South Africa. There are places where that's happening. But overall, we don't see it happening. And again, it's because the focus is on things that have nothing to do with the benefit of South Africans or the benefit of the United States as trading partners. The Trump administration is very skeptical of a lot of these global trade agreements. And while Trump is open, I think, to having these trade agreements, he wants to renegotiate many of them, including with great friends of the United States like Canada and Mexico. He wants to renegotiate these agreements so that we are seeing our interests met. For example, in his first term, he renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Now there's a new free trade agreement, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which he negotiated, but he was willing to tear it up and start raising tariffs on Canada and Mexico this week, unless Canada and Mexico helped with the migration crisis, because they've just been letting people cross our border, especially on the Mexican border, without any interference. So after threatening the tariffs, Mexico agreed, okay, fine, we'll send 10,000 soldiers to our southern border. Canada is also sending 10,000 soldiers to its border. And they're going to take seriously the traffic of people and drugs and so forth. So Trump is going to look at all of these free trade agreements and say, what are we getting out of it? And are we being exploited? Are we being taken advantage of? If you're getting free trade benefits from the United States, but then you go to the International Court of Justice and you attack a key American ally under attack from terrorists, well, then maybe you shouldn't have those benefits because you clearly have money to spend on sending teams of lawyers in robes and wigs and whatever to The Hague to strut around and misquote the Bible. I mean, it just looks like we're being taken advantage of, and it feels that way as well. So I think that AGOA is not dead, but it will be renegotiated. And if South Africa wants to benefit from it, it's going to have to make serious changes to its foreign and domestic policies.
Michael, what, there are about 250,000 South African jobs that are dependent on AGOA. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's a huge number of jobs.
Mike, I know you wanted to ask Joel about the downsides to America because we saw Gwede Mantashe this week saying, well, if Donald Trump does this, we're going to cut off minerals. You had questions about rare earth minerals and things like that.
Yeah, one of South Africa's sort of cards, Joel, has been that we have rare earth minerals, one of the few stable allies that has access to these rare earth minerals that are going to be so important in the future. And, by sort of playing hardball with us, it will limit America's supply. Do you think that's an argument that has any weight in Washington at the moment?
I definitely think that's a card South Africa can play. And look, the reality is that China has tied up a huge percentage of the world's rare earth minerals. So we're already dealing with a rival power that we don't really like necessarily in order to obtain those rare earth minerals. But I would also say this, minerals is a dynamic system. We know where things are at the moment, but people are discovering new resources all the time. There was recently a massive lithium discovery in Arkansas. And Arkansas, it's sort of an out of the way place to many foreign visitors, notable mostly for the fact that it's home to Bill Clinton and to Walmart, the big supermarket chain in the United States. But it's also home to diamond deposits, and they've just discovered a massive supply of lithium. There are new resources being discovered all the time, rare earths and so on. In Alaska alone, there's enough coal to power the United States for 300 years. So while we would prefer to have access to these minerals where there already is a mining infrastructure in South Africa, it's not something that's going to trump America's fundamental interest. It's certainly not going to change course, I think, for the Trump administration. And if we have to innovate to find alternative sources, then we will. But again, there's a sense in the United States that South Africa is taking advantage of us, and it's a sense that's shared by both Republicans and Democrats. There are different concerns that Republicans also have and voice more frequently than Democrats, like about land reform and so forth, the things that Trump was talking about earlier in the week. That tends to be more of a conservative interest. But there is a sense among both parties that the South African government has played kind of a double game for far too long. And it's time to choose whether you're with the Western world or not. And I think it's better for South Africa to be part of the West. I mean, if the central point of pride in South African history is a democratic transition, why are South Africa's best friends at the moment these authoritarian regimes, Russia and China, and these anarchist terrorists in Gaza? I mean, it's not taking South Africa anywhere. It's taking us further apart as countries, but it's really not even good for South Africa itself.
So, Joel, do we have a hard stop in 5 minutes, or do we have some degree of flexibility?
Unfortunately I have to go because I can't be late for the cabinet secretary. So let's do a few more minutes and then we can, maybe there's another time to talk, but I'll just take questions and I'll try to be short in my replies.
Okay, so I'm going to ask people who are watching us on Zoom, on Facebook, and on YouTube, if you have a quick question, but literally a one-liner, please post it into the chat now, and we'll bring all of that through to Joel, and he'll try to answer as many as possible. But Joel, I want to put you in a difficult position, because I want you to put yourself into the position of the South African president and the South African government. If
Mhm.
you were to give them advice, tell us what you'd say to them.
Federalism. You have this amazing system, which is like ours, at least in theory, where the 9 provinces can experiment with different approaches. And as an outside observer and as a resident from 2000 to 2006, it's pretty clear that the results of the experiment are in. And the Western Cape model is a successful one. And I would emulate that in other provinces rather than sticking with the failed approaches that have led some of those provinces to where they are now. I mean, I give the example in 2022, I was driving in Limpopo province. I was trying to find a town that my grandfather lived in once upon a time, and the road was more pothole than road. And during the same trip, I visited a friend in Oudtshoorn, and as I was driving from Oudtshoorn to Cape Town, the roads were magnificent. I mean, they were very, very good. And these were small country roads. Okay, so you immediately notice the difference. And why is that? It's not because they inherited different roads. It's because of the ways that these provincial governments have decided to manage themselves. So I would say to the South African government, delegate more power to the provinces that are successful. And for example, in the Western Cape, let the Western Cape do more of what it's doing in terms of investing in alternative power generation and let them become a more liberal economic zone. Let them have greater freedom from regulation and labor laws because the world wants to invest in South Africa if it can get around the BEE requirement that you have to give up 30% of your company or whatever it is as soon as you arrive, or that you have to deal with these unions that basically make it impossible for companies to manage their workflow. Give power to provinces to set their own policies on issues that have thus far been national. That's what I would do if I were the South African president.
So, Joel, we've got lots of questions coming in. Everyone
Yeah.
seems to have the same question, and I'm not going to pose it to you because the question that
I
they
know what it
ask.
is. The answer is I don't know. That's the answer.
Okay, but I presume the process would be the Secretary of State has been appointed. I presume Ryan Frame, who I believe you know as well, tells me that the Undersecretary of State for African Affairs should be appointed next before any African ambassadors. But the one question is, if you were offered the job, would you be willing to accept it?
Yes.
And and the other question that keeps on coming back is South Africa has appointed an ambassador to the United States, Ibrahim Rasool. He has previously expressed great support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad and many of the other radical groups within the Middle East. How should the United States react to a South African ambassador whose credentials, I believe, were accepted on the 13th of January, shortly before Biden left office? But how would a Trump administration react to a South African ambassador who has been so hostile towards American interests?
Well, I'm fairly sure the South African government knew who it was appointing before it sent its ambassador and knew what his views were. So it has made a statement about its own views in appointing him. I don't think that genie can be put back in the bottle. So there is an article that's out there this week from a couple of fairly well-respected foreign policy gurus in the United States saying that Trump should actually reject the credentials of the South African ambassador. That's one point of view. The other point of view is the credentials have been accepted. We don't tend to go around telling diplomats that they have to go unless they've really committed egregious crimes. I mean, we understand that you have diplomats from countries you disagree with. You're not going to. If we had to waste time picking and choosing diplomats based on their political views, I think it would just preoccupy the State Department far too much. It's sorry, here go the energy friendly lights again. Typical California. We're so energy friendly that we don't have electricity. It's not an unfamiliar problem in South Africa. But look, I think that having an ambassador like that is a statement about where the South African government stands, and that needs to change. I mean, those are the policies that South Africa embraces as a government. Ibrahim Rasool posted proudly that he got a scarf or something from the leader of Hamas, who was then assassinated in Tehran. Well, South Africa is aligned with the leader of Hamas. I mean, the ANC has met with the leadership of Hamas. So it's not like he doesn't
In fact,
represent
they invited the leadership of Hamas to South Africa in
Yeah.
November 2023, and shortly after the 7th of October attacks, Naledi Pandor called Hamas to, as Hamas says, congratulate them on the success of the Al-Aqsa flood operation, the invasion of Israel.
Yeah, so I don't think it's really the role of any country to tell another government who it's going to send, unless they're, some kind of serial killer or something like that. I mean, there really is in international diplomacy, there's a lot of leeway for who countries send to other places. The issue is really why was he sent? And why did they choose that person? There could be a million reasons, and I can't read the minds of whoever sent Ibrahim Rasool. But I have to think that one of the things they thought was going to happen was that Donald Trump was going to lose. I think they may have, and I believe he was sent before the November election, or at least he was named ambassador. I think they made a bet that was wrong. I think they anticipated a further movement to the left if the Biden administration or then the Harris administration continued in office. And so they sent an ambassador who could best manage that policy process with regard to South Africa and perhaps entice the United States further into, what is becoming the anti-Israel camp, and sort of the left-wing camp, and maybe obtain more aid in that sense. I have no idea. I don't know what their strategy was. I just think they made the wrong bet. And now the approach is to say, well, Trump won. We'll just do what we did the last time he won. When he won the first time, South Africa said, well, let's go to our friends in Congress and we'll work with them instead. Or let's go to our friends in the State Department. We'll work with them instead. Or let's go to our friends at USAID. Well, that worked the first time, but now Trump has figured it out. So the people at USAID are now run by the State Department. The people who used to run the State Department are now Trump loyalists. They're not just people who've been there forever. And Congress is not on your side anymore, at least if you're the ANC government, because the Democrats are upset with South Africa's conduct on Russia and China as well. So I just think that these typical strategies of coping and finessing these policy differences just aren't going to work anymore, whoever the ambassador is.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Don't you think that a more nuanced approach might work better? That by you're associating the government with the whole of South Africa, and we've seen the ANC's deteriorating in support every year after year. Shouldn't America be supporting, good forces for good in the country that could actually help, reduce the ANC's power and make South Africa strong and promote a more Western approach for the country? Don't you think you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater? And there's a scope for a much more nuanced approach where you support NGOs and organizations in the country that are fighting for many of the same things that America would like to see.
I can't rule that out. It's just that how do you do that really? I mean, you have to deal with the government itself, and it's also a national unity government. So it's a government that represents the government and the opposition. So in a sense, the whole country is on the hook for the policies of the government. Now, having said that, I'm aware of the criticism that says if AGOA changes, then the people who will suffer the most are South African farmers and South African manufacturers. These are actually the most pro-Western constituencies in South Africa. I think that's an interesting perspective that I think the Trump administration will have to take into account. So I think there is something to what you're saying. But at the same time, once you try... Look, I'm not opposed to what you're saying, but I don't think you can be less blunt than you have to be with the government itself and just be absolutely clear that what they're doing is unacceptable. And it's unacceptable to us on the world stage. We think it is also unacceptable domestically. This is not how successful countries run their affairs. Now, South Africa is a sovereign country, can decide to do what it wants, but it will not be as useful a partner if it is not a strong and prosperous and growing country. It's just not going to be as useful to us. So if you do choose a different path, if you choose to go with China, or you choose to go the path of racial redistribution and expropriation and so forth, well, that's a choice you're making that will affect your ability domestically to be useful to us or really to anybody else.
Joel, can I squeeze in one very last question?
Yeah, sure.
Because this week, I think Donald Trump surprised many people with his solutions to Gaza and the Middle East conflict. Is this a well thought through policy? Is this something that came off the cuff? What do you think of these very different ideas and their chances of success? From the outside, it looks like nice throwaway ideas, but they throw away ideas without any hope of success. Or has he physically changed the paradigm, the way we think about the Middle East?
Well, whether it's true or not that the United States is going to have an ownership stake in Gaza, I think it's actually a brilliant idea for a number of reasons. First of all, the best analogy I heard in some ways was an analogy that argued essentially what he's doing is he's trying to get other people to do something about Gaza. So by announcing this really radical proposal for American ownership of Gaza, he's trying to get the Arab countries to step up. In the same way, and this, forgive the gendered nature of this analogy, but there was a woman who said to me, it's like when I want my husband to repair something, I tell him to show me where the tools are, and then I'll do it myself. And then he gets so irritated that he gets up off the couch and does what I wanted him to do anyway. So I think Trump, in a way, is saying, okay, I'm going to do this myself since none of you seem to be willing to do it. And the idea maybe is that the Saudis and the Emiratis then come forward and do it. There's another factor here, which is a real estate factor. If you take a piece of property that nobody wants and you suddenly decide that you're going to put an offer in on it, you've suddenly increased the value. And then there's a chance someone else might come in and try to buy it as well. Once someone shows an interest in owning something, it raises the value of that thing. Gaza has been written off as a kind of hellhole, Israel's problem, nobody cares about it. But once Trump says, hey, I want to own it, then other people say, well, wait a minute, maybe there is some value there. It's in the right place. It's near some very good things like the Israeli economy. It's on the Mediterranean. It's near some Russian naval bases. We might want to be near those. So suddenly people are taking a look at it and say, hey, what does Trump see in this property that he wants to own it? So it actually increases the chance other people will invest in it. And then finally, in a last resort, if the United States does control it, I think it's the most effective way to make sure that Hamas doesn't get in. Gaza is not Iraq with open borders where you can smuggle terrorist material very easily. I mean, with Trump and Egypt and Israel there, I think Gaza is actually manageable. And then the what he wants to do is move a lot of the Palestinian population out to somewhere else. That's very controversial, but Gaza is too crowded as it is. It's not been allowed to expand anywhere else. And so maybe he's right and they don't necessarily have to go to Egypt or Jordan. They could go elsewhere. I heard Israeli diplomats talking about Indonesia. Indonesia wants to do a deal with Israel. That could be part of the deal. I made a proposal that was rejected by some of my Israeli friends, which was that, well, why don't we just build a new city or two in the West Bank inside the area that's earmarked for a Palestinian state? Just move some of the Gaza residents there. That way, you're not transferring anybody out of the population of a future Palestinian state. You're not precluding a Palestinian state. You're just moving people out of this strip of territory, which really just is a problem for everybody. You allow some people to remain, those who are nonviolent and aren't going to shoot rockets. But the Israeli counterpoint was, well, yeah, you're just moving all the people who want to shoot rockets to the West Bank, which is closer to Jerusalem and closer to Tel Aviv. So look, I think it's complicated, but what Trump has done essentially is he's shaken the box. And what he said, we're not going back to the paradigm of sitting down with the Palestinian Authority, which also supports terrorism, and begging them, pretty please, won't you take out the garbage and run the schools and run the hospitals? You know, this kind of nickel and diming that still presumes that Palestinian control of Gaza is a given hasn't worked. Palestinian control of Gaza is a failed experiment over 20 years. So there's got to be some other way of doing it. And I think that's what he's done. So no matter what the outcome is in the end, it's not going to be run by Palestinians themselves. It's either going to be run by the United States or by Saudi Arabia or the Emiratis or somebody else who will exercise authority there that keeps the terrorists out and provides the best chance for Gaza to become prosperous. It will not become prosperous under Palestinian rule. It just won't.
Joel Pollak, you've provided us a great thought-provoking evening this evening. We're going to ask Sarah Gond and Stephen Cruz to join us. We're going to be discussing for the rest of the evening some of the perspectives that you've given us and the views and the South African perspective to all of us. But you've been so generous with your time, and I think it's time you and your wife came home. We're waiting for you here.
All right. Well, you can write to the White House. I think their address is at whitehouse.gov. You can put
1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I think we're there.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Joel. Thank you so much. Appreciate all your time.
Thanks.
And Sarah, if we can ask you to put on your camera as well. But before we actually launch into the discussion, Dylan, there are people who participate in our webinars, who read our newspaper. There are 36,000 people who get our newsletter every week. There are 120,000 people who visit our website. We do an enormous amount for this community. And it's important to have a Jewish voice. And since the 7th of October, having a Jewish voice needs courage. We need that same courage from our community. You please have to support the South African Jewish Report newspaper, to continue the webinars, to continue the newspaper. This is no joke. We've got a target. We have to survive, and you have to unfortunately help us. So I want to ask Dylan to please put onto the screen a way for people to donate. For people who are watching us on Zoom as well, we're going to be putting up a poll. If you're willing for us to contact you to make a donation, please click yes if you're on YouTube. I see there's some people that say no. Well, please feel free to log off. But we believe that the service that we provide to the community is so crucial that we would love to have you as part of this journey, because without you, at 350,000 Rand print and distribution costs a month, without paying a single journalist, without paying an editor, without paying a fact checker, this is an unsustainable model. And if you want the only voices on Israel and the Jewish people to be the rancid, torrid rantings of the Daily Maverick or the News 24, who fired Howard Feldman because they couldn't bear to have a Zionist on their staff, or Iqbal surveys independent online. If you want them to be the voice of your community, then do nothing. But we think our community is bold and courageous, and we think you're going to be joining us in this journey as well. And that's why we're asking you, please let us know if you're on Zoom, on the poll that you have in front of you, that we can contact you for a donation. And in another minute, I'm going to ask Dylan to please put up on the screen as well, particularly for those people watching us on Facebook and Zoom as well, to put up where you can scan our bank account details and where you can make a donation as well. So I'm going to leave that up for about another 30 seconds. And in about 30 seconds, Dylan will take down the poll. And at the same time, he's going to put up the donation screen as well. But Stephen,
I would
Sarah,
ask some questions if they can contribute from abroad. There are people asking how they
yes,
contribute to the US.
absolutely, they can contribute from abroad. The poll, the links that Dylan will be posting in the chat section on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Zoom will allow you a wallet doc. You can use your credit card to donate, or just let us know. And absolutely, we would love you to please make a donation, no matter where you are in the world. We believe that these conversations are absolutely, absolutely crucial. And with that, we're going to leave the screen up for another minute. You can click on the links. But Stephen Cruz, let's start with you. You heard a very interesting perspective. It's a perspective from the right, but it's a perspective that's probably very mainstream within the Republican Party today. What do you think?
Yeah, look, Joel is very knowledgeable, very erudite, certainly put his arguments across very strongly. But you're right, and the right at the moment is ascendant in the US. Not only did Donald Trump win by a landslide to get into the White House, but both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, have very thin, but they have Republican majorities. So this kind of thinking is not new. As Joel said, for the last year or two, there have been bills that have been making their way through Congress to thoroughly review the US's relationship with South Africa. One specifically mentioned relations with China, with Russia, with Iran, and Hamas. These things are serving as an irritant to the American administration. It's interesting how Trump chose to raise the issue. He didn't really talk about it, but making claims about land being expropriated, the law may make that easier, but it's not fair to say that is being done willy-nilly at the moment. It might happen in the future, and we need to be very vigilant. But I think the sentiment of enough is enough is ascendant in the American political scene. Trump was not very interested in Africa in his first term. We all know the expletives that he used to describe the countries. He was dismissive. One way it came on his radar was because of fighting ISIS and other Islamic terrorist groups on the African continent. But this is not the first tweet like this from Trump. In 2018, very similar ideas came across from him. And it's certainly, as Joel said, shaking the tree or shaking the box. It's provoked all sorts of reactions in South Africa, and it's game on.
So, Saragon, the big issue this week appeared to be the issue of the Expropriation Act, recently signed by the president. Walk us through, how dangerous is this act? Has land been expropriated as he suggested, or is it just a threat of expropriation? Why should he and why should we be worried about the act, if at all?
I think he wasn't very helpful because a lot of the thrust of what he said was that it affects certain people or certain minorities. And it doesn't. It potentially affects absolutely every South African. It doesn't matter, rural, urban, tribal land. And it's not just land that's at risk, it's property in general. So anything that is owned by a South African or a South African company or organization theoretically can be expropriated. Now, expropriation is not an unusual concept. Countries worldwide have expropriation laws on their books in order to, for example, very commonly build roads, public roads. It needs access to land that would make the building of a road feasible, should be of economic benefit to a country, and it may involve having to get into expropriation, to expropriate land to do so. But generally, the idea is that you don't do it easily, you don't do it lightly, and you pay fair compensation for that. And the problem with South Africa is that, first of all, the act is vague in exactly what it means by expropriation. For a start, it's not clear, for example, when you're talking about land, whether you're including the buildings on the land or any improvements made to the land. There's been a tendency, and I think our president did the same thing, was talk about it in land reform terms. It is not per se a land reform measure. It can be used by a government in land reform processes, but land reform processes otherwise are a distinct and separate issue, and to a very large extent, in whether you like the way it's been done or not done, a lot of it has been resolved. And there's a tendency to be romantic about rural land. And in fact, South Africa is now a majority, like most countries in the world, urbanizing society. And it's urban land, it's urban property that people need access to. So it's in itself, it's not an unusual measure, but it's these uncertainties. It's also the fact that, as Joel mentioned, as soon as you're talking about expropriation and you're talking about it in loaded terms and unclear terms, that is a no-no both for local and foreign investors, because you needn't expropriate the land, but you may decide there are reasons. I'm throwing it out a bit, but reasons why you'd expropriate a factory or a business or a pension fund, etc. So it's not confined to land, but it is one of the great no-nos for investors. They can put up with actually a lot of problems in a country that they choose to invest in, but knowing that they have property rights, knowing their property rights are secure and that they would be really not easily challenged, that is the big problem with expropriation without compensation, with the idea of expropriation without compensation.
So the key problem is twofold, as I understand it. Just to reflect back to you, the one is the purpose for expropriation. That's because the Act says you can expropriate someone's land for land reform purposes. So your land tenure is not secure. That's the first thing. And the second is this idea they can expropriate without adequate compensation or any compensation at all. The actual issue of expropriation is not the problem. It's those two elements of it.
Well, it's those elements, and because the term expropriation is not clear, one of our big concerns is whether it could lead to custodianship. Now, the ANC has already taken custodianship over water rights and mineral rights. So, in other words, to have access to water and minerals, you have to apply essentially for a permit to do so. Now, if that's expanded, essentially, what you're looking at is a government taking authority over a whole lot of rights that we believe private property rights are fundamental to growth and fundamental to what makes a society successful. And I think part of the problem may well be that the ANC looks to China as an example of not necessarily protecting those rights at all in its success. But China is China. You can't compare what we may or may not be to China. China is sui generis, if I can put it that way. And it also, by virtue of, if nothing else, of having a huge population, it's a very, very big market. Our fortunes really lie in the way that most countries become prosperous, and that is generally a free market, free speech, protection of property rights regime. And to get growth, those are the sort of rights that you have to be seen to observe and protect.
Michael, you're a keen watcher of politics in South Africa, and the president convenes almost annually these big international investment conferences, and we hear about the hundreds of billions of rands that are going to be invested, which never seem to actually materialize. But when you do things like that, You expect the government policies to be the most friendly to those people who want to invest in the country. What on earth is Ramaphosa thinking when he does things like the Expropriation Act, where he supports Hamas, where he does all of these things that are going to tell anyone with any money that this is not a stable place to invest and get a return? What do you think's going on in his head?
And the irony is that the Expropriation Act was actually signed while he was at Davos, which is the sort of centerpiece of international investor conference. It's the global annual investor conference. So why he would sign the bill while he was actually at Davos with all the people that he needs to invest in the country is beyond me. I think it is very strange that they said, look, he is pandering. It's internal politics also that he's got to pander to certain people in his party and outside his party, to the EFF, etc. There is a lot of opposition on the left in the country, and he does need to take those views for internal party political reasons into account. The slogan of expropriation without compensation was Jacob Zuma's key message, and got a lot of support within certain sectors of the ANC and now within MK and the EFF. So, he sort of feels he's walking a little bit of a middle ground with this expropriation bill. He hasn't amended the constitution, and it was a watered down version of what some to the left of Ramaphosa would like. So he's also walking a tightrope. But he seems to give in quite a lot to the left-wing flank, at the expense of South Africans' economic interests, to be honest.
So, Steve, the one question that I asked Joel that maybe the answer surprised me the most, I asked him the question was, if you were to give advice to the South African government, what advice would you give them? And he answered, I would change the kind of the nature of the country into a federal state. I wasn't expecting an answer like that. I was expecting something maybe a lot more practical. So I want to give each of our panelists a chance to answer that question in their view. If you were in a position to sit down with the president and say, this is the one piece of advice I have for you in order to improve the country, improve the nation. Steve, let's start with you, and then I'm going to ask Sarah and Michael, what would that one piece of advice be?
It's not an easy question. I would say restore hope in the country. I think we've been on a steady downward track. When he came in 2018, he was the non-Zuma, and with all his credentials in the unions and in the negotiations and in business, people thought this was the Messiah. He's proved very disappointing. But I think even in May, there was a bit of a lift that the ANC had slipped below 50%, and that there was a government of national unity, that the government of national unity wasn't struck with the parties on the left, but in fact the sort of centrist, maybe to the right parties, the DA and others. But really, I think inspire us, give us leadership, give us hope that things can be better. Make the bold choices that you found so difficult, that he just prevaricates and forms a committee on and a commission of inquiry, and we go around and around the same circles again. So be decisive, be bold, and show leadership.
Sarah, you've got your time with the president now. Spill your heart.
Trust South Africans as individuals. Give them the space to start businesses, to expand businesses, to create an environment where it's attractive to employ people. And in this respect, it means that giving a lot more space to employ people who don't have the skills and who don't have the education to ultimately end up in a really powerful negotiation situation. If you give them space to business to fire people who are not making the grade, it actually encourages business to employ people. And the crucial thing is, if you get people onto the ladder, most people will strive to try and go up that ladder. And it's So everything is self-fulfilling. The hands of the economy, the state is not best to provide it, and least of all, an ANC state which has not trusted business and sees very much as the state being the power behind it. It's not where the power lies. The power should be in the hands of the people. Give us a space, let them do it and grow the economy.
Okay, Mike?
I agree with Sarah quite a lot, actually. I think that we've got to back business to grow. South Africans are very innovative. We've got great minds. You know, Joel actually mentioned it, Elon Musk, to think of the people that have come out of South Africa is quite amazing, both inside the country and internationally. And you know, the government's shown that it can't solve problems. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the people, they don't have the financial resources anymore. We've got quite a lot of debt, and so I think he's got to work with business to actually solve all of South Africa's problems, whether it's the ports, whether it's the roads, whether it's the railway, whether it's electricity, whether it's water. There's no way that the ANC is going to solve these big infrastructure problems on its own. And without those, the country is not going to function. If you don't have functioning railways, you don't have functioning roads, you don't have electricity, you don't have water, you don't have an economy. And he's got to work very quickly with business to bring in the resources and the skills to help solve those major infrastructure problems that we face.
And of course, I would say to him, the Cold War is over. The time for ideology is over. If you want to attract investment, if you want to give business confidence, then start behaving in a manner that allows you to be part of the world. Don't make enemies out of people who don't need to be your enemy. And so with that, Mike, I want to ask, this is an entire cohort of South Africans, and I'm actually going to say Southern Africans around Trump that are probably keeping us on the agenda. Who are these people that have an interest in South Africa that surround Trump?
Obviously, Elon Musk is the most prominent South African that's surrounding Trump and seems to have an inordinate amount of power within the administration. And I think he's had a difficult history with South Africa. You know, he had a difficult childhood growing up here in South Africa, and I'm not sure what his feelings towards the country are actually, because of the sort of what happened to him here in his childhood. And also from a personal level, the Starlink issue that he was denied the opportunity to invest here, there could be a lot of sour grapes. So you have got someone who's very, very powerful in the administration that's ex-South African, that knows the country well and comes from with a certain ideological view that that may be pulling internal policy with regard to South Africa quite strongly.
But of course, it's not just him, because you have, for example, his new crypto czar, South African. You have Peter Thiel, who, he was in fact Namibian rather than South African. There's this entire cohort that surrounds him, and you have people like Gary Player, for whom these issues of ownership are very, very important to have, who have the ear of the president. And so it's going to be kept top of the agenda, I believe. Steve, when Joel said that AGOA is probably gone, was that a shock to you? Because I think many people thought it would be the last remaining thing to try to keep South Africa in the fold.
Well, there's two things. One is South Africa in AGOA. That seems to have been settled to me, that when we hosted one of the summits last year, and there were moves to expel South Africa, it didn't happen. But the fact is, this is not a bilateral trade agreement. This is a law of the American Congress. It needs to, and it expires in September 2025, sorry, in toto. If it's not extended by Congress, everybody, those 33 countries that are beneficiaries of this, will have to find another arrangement. We know that Trump is transactional. That's you give me something that I give you. Why should we be giving you guys access to your markets if we don't have to our markets if we don't have access to yours? You got to give a little to get a little. He made the quid pro quo phrase very famous before Ukraine was invaded and when in his first term. So there's got to be a deal somewhere. But the automatic rollover of AGOA, which has existed since the year 2000, so it's also like PEPFAR, 25 years old, from the George W. Bush era is not guaranteed. And again, the comments I made earlier is that the Republicans have a razor thin but a majority in both houses. And this sort of what Joel was saying is Americans are asking, where are our tax dollars going? I mean, this is not an aid program. It's a market access law that is in the American Congress, and they tried to push it through before the start of the Trump term, and for various reasons, also the money that was going to go to the borders, and there's a lot of horse trading in American politics. It didn't make it through. I think African countries are petrified.
Sarah, what do you think the impact will be on South Africa should South Africa either be booted out of AGOA or AGOA in its entirety be cancelled?
There seem to be different views on how valuable AGOA is or is not to the South African economy. But irrespective of what view you take on it, it's the message that the Americans are sending. And it's a bit like if South Africa the South African government has to express a measure of humility and understand that everything in this world is about interests. All your foreign policy must be about interests, and our interests are not likely to be best served by the tyrants, by the non-democracies. So it's accepting that South Africa is not as important as the ANC feels it is. It's got to ditch old views. It's got to ditch a sense of romanticism. It's got to become more pragmatic. And it's a bit like, a cheeky, let me use an analogy, a cheeky employee, contradicting a powerful boss at the wrong time. The boss is the boss. And let's be honest, we just don't have the power to treat America as an equal. They're not. And we're not the only country that does it. But we certainly don't, because so little of what is being done and would appeal to an administration like Trump's and a person like Trump. And as Stephen said, it's the American taxpayers' money at the end of the day, and it's something I think the government doesn't sufficiently appreciate about what it does with our money. It doesn't make our money. It isn't the government's money. It's tax money. It's the money that should be going to the benefit of the people of South Africa as far as our taxation goes. So the same is going to apply to America, and America has the power and the size to make the choices. We don't.
So, Steve, there were three things that happened in the last kind of 24 hours. The one is that Cyril Ramaphosa clearly wanted to talk to Donald Trump, and clearly Trump was not willing to talk to him. And that's why he landed up at Elon Musk. Is there a sign in that? Number one. Number two, Ronald Lamola says we're going to talk to the Americans as equals, but Sarah's saying to us, this isn't a relationship of equals. We have to realize who holds the power in this relationship. And the third thing is Ramaphosa saying today this can be solved over a round of golf. I'm not quite sure how good Ramaphosa is at golf, or I'm not sure if Donald Trump is still cheating at golf or not. But those were three interesting comments of how we think we can solve the relationship. You're at the South African Institute of International Affairs. You watch the nuances in politics all the time. I'm reminded of I think it was in The Earth is Flat, or one of the Thomas Friedman books, when he said he used to be between Beirut and Jerusalem. People were shooting at him every day. And then he got assigned by the New York Times to the White House. And all he had to do was analyze the nuances of words. So help us analyze that nuance for us of what's really happening in the relationship now.
Yeah, I mean, I think South Africa has not accepted that we are not as important as we once were. Or that we think we are. I mean, I think being palmed off to Elon Musk is a sign of Musk's influence and power. I think Trump, we know, can be petty and can be vindictive, and he just doesn't want to afford South Africa the opportunity to have these conversations that everybody seems so desperate to have, and so convinced that if we tell our story, everything's going to be okay. I mean, we saw. Another thing Ramaphosa is very fond of doing is sending delegations to to Africa when we have xenophobic violence. We send envoys to Nigeria, and we've sent a few to the US in the last couple of years as well, even before the Trump administration. South Africa is very protective of its foreign policy. Agree with it or not. We assert our sovereignty, and I think that's where Lamola is coming from, that there must be respect in the relationship, there must be tolerance and listening, of course, unless you're dealing with Israel, then that's a totally different matter. And yeah, a round of golf is perhaps long overdue, I would say, but it depends who has the better handicap, and I think we know who that is.
We're going to come around for one last round of questions. Let me tell you what the question is, so you'll have a moment to think about it. I've been getting News 24 notifications the entire time about what's happened at the State of the Nation address. Haven't really had a chance to look at them. I want to give you guys an opportunity to maybe pick up one thing from the State of the Nation address that maybe you want to address or comment on this evening. But before we do that, I want to talk about the fact that at the start of this, I said we need to learn to listen to each other. And throughout the evening, we were trolled by a failed journalist, failed comedian, moron who thought that he should use this opportunity to post things continuously on the chat. But you know something, that was his right. I hope by him tuning in, he actually listened and learned. And if he wasn't able to do that, that is his great misfortune. But we're not going to shut down our discussion because some moronic failed troll wants to troll us. He should be here to learn, as all of us have been here to learn as well. And that's why, despite the hundreds of messages I received to say, please turn off the comments, please shut him down, he's entitled to opinion. And I think the amazing thing is, he saw tonight, of the thousands and thousands of people watching, none of them agreed with him. If that doesn't tell him a story, then nothing else will. Just before we come on to our final round of questions that we're going to be posing to people, I want you, if you haven't had a chance yet, to donate to the Jewish Report. If you're able to do so, if you want to keep the voice of the Jewish Report alive in an enormously hostile environment where we see media and government trying to shut down the voices that our community has and that many people of normal South African society, other than the political elite, have, then you have to try keep the Jewish Report alive. And to do that, we ask you to be bold and courageous and to make a donation to the Jewish Report. So Dylan, please put on the screen two things. If you're on Zoom, there's a donation poll. If you want us to contact you for a donation and you haven't yet done so, please just click yes. But we are also going to be putting up a screen which will have our banking details, which will have a wallet doc, which will have a link that will take you to a Zapper code as well. So we really urge absolutely everyone to watch. We think we add to the conversation in South Africa, and we're willing to speak to absolutely everyone. And when I look at, for example, some of the nonsense that we see in the media, and I'm going to single out much of that media, the Daily Maverick, the editor who actually destroyed the Mail and Guardian is destroying the Daily Maverick as well. They think they can find the one or two anti-Zionist nutcase Jews, and they should be the voice of our community. We will not be silenced by the crazies, and we believe they are the crazies and the insane. This view of the press in South Africa does not represent the world. We are the voice of our community, and we will not be silenced. And the way to make sure of that is with your help. So Dylan, I don't see you putting up that slide. Please, I'm asking you to put up the slide so people can make a donation. If you're watching us on Facebook, on Zoom, or on YouTube tonight, we ask you just to take a moment, and Dylan, please leave that slide up while we move over to comments about the State of the Nation this evening. Michael, let's start with you. is that a fair thing for you to go first? What have you picked up from the News 24 other alerts about the state of the nation that you're happy about, concerned about, or indifferent to?
So it doesn't look like much has changed, to be honest. It looks like it's a bit of a warm up and repeat from last year. I haven't had a chance to go through the whole speech, but it doesn't seem, we spoke about the need for transformation, for radical transformation in South Africa, the way the government thinks, for new ideas and new policies. But it looks like it's really just a microwave meal that's been warmed up, the same thing he delivered last year, and he sort of doesn't seem to have made much changes on most of his the same positions he's held for most of the years he's been president. So I don't think there's anything, from what I can see, meaningful that's come out of it.
Sarah, was this, from what you can see, a speech of the state of the government of national unity, or was this an African National Congress State of the Nation address?
Howard, I'm going to confess that I can no longer multitask on these issues. I'll have to get to the SONA afterwards, but I'm going to exercise a little bit of chutzpah and just pick up on the point you made about free speech. Being the director of the Free Speech Union of South Africa, I can only echo that however awful speech may or may not be, the freer the speech with as few restrictions, the better, because you can't deal with problems if you don't know what they are. And one of the things that South Africa does have, and it kind of leads, particularly in the Anglophone world, is it has a robust free speech. I know that some politicians would rather we didn't have, but it's something that was let out the bag in '94, and we won't easily give it up. And as South Africans, we have become used to, and we must continue to exercise that free speech. But on the SONA, I'll have to pass it on.
Okay. Steve, can you multitask?
No, was so riveted by our conversation here that unfortunately I don't get the same alerts that you do, so I haven't had a chance to look at it. But I'm not expecting seismic movements. I just was reading something this week where Thomas Jefferson said something to the effect of, if he were to have the choice between governments with no newspapers or newspapers with no government, he would choose newspapers. And I can echo that. I'm very proud and privileged to write regularly for the Jewish Report, and I echo Howard's appeal that people should be generous in a time when our voice needs to be heard more than ever.
So I have one more question for our audience. People have told us they've joined us from all over the world. It's been remarkable to see how many places. And when we go through the list, we have people who watch us in Mexico and in Panama and in Argentina and Bangkok and Nigeria. It's like amazing that we've built around the world this following. But the one thing we did tonight was, during the week, we started at 7 p.m., not at 8 p.m., which we usually do. And I'd love people just in the comments section as well to tell us, is that a good time for you or not? We'd love to know what's the most convenient. We've always presumed that people come home and they see their families and they have dinner, and 8 o'clock kind of is a good time to start, but maybe we're wrong. So we'd love to hear your opinion. Please, if you can just leave us some information in the chat section on Zoom, on Facebook, on YouTube. But I want to thank our remarkable panelists this evening. Michael Kransdorff, we could never have done this without you. I knew Joel, and I called you and I said, can you put us in touch? And within minutes, you put us in touch. And within minutes of that, Joel had responded as well. And I think that's the level of esteem that he holds our community in, and the love that he has for South Africa. I think we cannot misplace the fact that he may have some very strong views about the country and the way we're behaving, but it comes from a position of love. He's born in South Africa. His wife is South Africa. He's married into anti-apartheid royalty. He was an activist in South Africa. He's been involved in South African politics. And his love for South Africa comes through in a way that I think brings us a brand new perspective on the world. So I want to thank everyone who's watched us. I want to thank Michael for helping to set it up. And most importantly, I want to thank Sarah and Steve, who've joined us this evening for some amazing insights and perspective. Thank you all. Good night to all of those of you who watched us this evening. It's been just so wonderful to have such a large audience. But I think this is a moment that really is important in our history. I think we're seeing a seismic shift in the relationship between the world's greatest superpower and our own nation. And the more we can understand it, I think the better we are as a nation itself. So thank you for joining us. Our next one that we hope to do is going to be a discussion on whether the government of national unity actually will survive or not. And I think we'll read carefully the text of tonight's State of the Nation address as we answer that question. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Night, Howard.
Thanks, Howard.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.